sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. In today's episode, we are going to be listening to Virgil and the Dukos. It was originally published in Asimov's science fiction, September 1997. We have a great guest today, Greg Feeley. He is an American teacher, critic, essayist, and author of speculative fiction. He has been an incredible advocate of Avram's, and I would say that along with Henry Wessel's, probably one of the two leading experts on Avram Davidson, and has just been, as I said, an incredible advocate along with Henry Wessel's, Neil Gaiman, Michael Swanwick. Greg has just been amazing. So we'll have him on in just a second. A little bit of housekeeping as always. I am still always on the search for volunteers. Please go to avramdavidson.com. We're always looking for, honestly, in any way you think you could help would be great. Just let me know. But proofreaders, artists who could do book covers, illustrators, KDP experts, advanced copy reviewers, video editing, anything you can think of to help would be fantastic. And with that, let's bring on Greg Feeley. Greg, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, glad to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we've talked a lot, and I'm so glad to finally see you in person.
Albeit only electronically.
One of these days, we'll actually get to meet up in person.
Yes, absolutely.
I mentioned in the introduction that you have been such an incredible advocate for Avram's over the years, and it hasn't gone unnoticed, and it's so appreciated by me and, you know, my mom and others. And, you know, thank you for keeping the legacy alive and finding, occasionally finding some unpublished manuscripts. So, you know, thank you from the bottom of my heart.
You're very welcome.
So I guess my first question is, how did you first discover Avram?
Oh boy. Well, that would have dated back to, oh gosh, mid to late 1960s. I'd have been 12 or 13. And roaming around the science fiction section of the public library, where they would have lots of old science fiction anthologies and issue magazines like volumes like The Best from Fantasy and Science Fiction from earlier in the 60s, mostly double-day hardcovers. The libraries all had, and most of those volumes would have a story by Avram in it. I remember that there was published Isaac Asimov edited a volume of the Hugo winning short fiction. I think the volume came out around 1962. It was probably 5 or 6 years later. I picked it up, and what was then, and may still be, Avram's most famous story, Or All the Seas with Oysters, won the Hugo Award. So it was in that volume. So I became, once I became old enough to sort of notice the bylines and remember who the author of a story I liked was, Avram was one of the names. I think perhaps the first story of his that really made a strong impact on me was Sakavarel, which appeared in one of those Best from F and SF volumes. I think at that time, most of Avram's novels had only appeared in paperback. So it would be a little bit longer before I started, visiting the local, Goodwill stores and secondhand stores to rummage through their secondhand paperbacks. But by that time, I was 12 or 13, I was reading a lot of science fiction, and Avram was at one of the high water marks of his career. So he had stories appearing in Orbit, stories appearing in Terry Carr anthologies. And by 1970, I think when the Phoenix and the Mirror was published by Ace, I read that, and by that time I was aware that he was a major writer. The writer that of his generation that I probably liked most of all, James Blish, spoke extremely highly of Avram's writing, reviewed it frequently, and and that helped me appreciate that there was something very special about Davidson's work.
Yeah. What do you, if you reflecting back, do you have a favorite? Do you have a particular story that you just think is, and sometimes I feel like I have to be careful in the way that I phrase this, because if you give something too challenging to begin with to someone, they might say, I don't get it. But, working your way up, what is the greatest in your mind, his greatest achievement or his greatest story? Or just one that you particularly like?
Well, if you're talking about where someone should start in reading something by Avram, I think one of the short stories is best. Certainly Sucker Varel or The Golem, or My Boyfriend's Name is Jello, are very good entryways in. And probably the story of his that I've always loved the most, the one for which I wrote an introduction for the Avram Davidson Treasury, was The Sources of the Nile. Yeah. And I encountered that in some Best from F&SF volume. And, for a 14-year-old, a lot of it went over my head. I understood that it was a slightly acerbic view of, Madison Avenue and Manhattan type stuff, of which I knew only, through movies and TV shows. But it had a richness, a complexity. There was an incidental wit in it, little bits in it, like raisins in a plum pudding that you could linger over. And I later decided that much of Avram's best work was at novelette length. And if you look at his very best works, things like The Slavo Stove, many of the Jack Limekiller stories, were at this length, 25, 35 printed pages long.
Yep. And then in terms of Virgil, the Virgil world, which obviously we're going to be listening to a story today from that universe. Do you think you could give, and I'll take a step back. The first time I read Phoenix in the Mirror, and I should rephrase that. The first time I tried to read Phoenix in the Mirror, that was attempt 1. I've since read it now 3 times. Each time it grows on me every time, to the point where now I'm just, wow, this is one of the most magnificent novels I've ever read. But it took a while. So is there anything you could say about, and maybe we'll focus on the Phoenix in the Mirror, but just introducing that world so that someone reading it at least could kind of understand what's going on, or just get a sense of what's going on, and not maybe go through what I went through in their initial attempt?
Okay, well, certainly the Phoenix in the Mirror is the place to start. It was the first volume of what Avram called the Virgil Magus cycle. It was published after a great deal of work. I remember, the spring of 1971, I was 16 and I went to a Nebula Awards banquet that the Science Fiction Writers of America put on. The West Coast Nebula Awards banquet was in Berkeley, and I went there, and I was had not yet published my first story, but I was on my way. And Avram was there. It was the first time I'd ever met him, and he was selling copies of the Doubleday edition out of a box. Doubleday had published it as part of their science fiction series, which published 2 or 3 at least novels a month and cycled through them pretty rapidly.
Mhm.
If the books were not intended to remain in print for very long. They were published essentially for the library trade and for subsidiary rights sales to the science fiction book club or to paperbacks. And after 3 or 4 months, any unsold copies would be pulped. And Avram's book did not sell quickly. And when they proposed to take what was left of the first edition, which was apparently most of it, and pulp it, he bought them himself and sold them for the rest of his life. And I think later consigned a large number of them to the New England Science Fiction Association, which is why for decades afterwards, you could buy a hardcover first edition of The Phoenix and the Mayor for its original title cover price of $4.95. And to this day, it's not an especially scarce or rare title because the unsold copies were rescued and escaped into the science fiction world, where people who bought them tended to hold on to them and pass them on. But I spoke to him a little bit, and at one point I asked him how long it had taken him to write the book, and he said about 10 years. When James Blish reviewed it, he said that he had first heard of it from Avram in 1960 at a Milford Writers Conference. The novel was first published in 1966 in a magazine in this sort of excerpted form. So it was done by then, although the AA only came out with it about 3 years later. So he plainly began working on this fairly early in his career as a published writer and worked on it for a very long time. It's clear that he worked on it as he was editing the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, as he was writing his early novels, most of which are commercial efforts, very high quality science fiction novels, but they were not at the level of the best short fiction he was publishing at the time, nor at the level of the novels he would publish a little bit later. They were written, I think, largely for money, good as they are. So he spent a lot of time on this, and in the introduction to it, of the original AA edition, there was a little author's note where he explains that the idea of Virgil, the Roman poet from about the 1st century AD, being not a poet, but a sorcerer, was a genuine medieval legend. It was not an idea that Avram came up with. And that there were a number of myths involving Virgil being able to do this or that magical thing. And for several hundred years in the medieval era, he was better known as a sorcerer than as the author of the Iliad, the Aeneid.
Yep.
So his idea was to write about this figure as though it really existed, and to set it in a world that constituted, in this sort of strange way, the medieval world's idea of what the ancient world was. So there is Tartary, there is the distant city of Muscovy, there is Egypt, A-E or A-I-G-Y-P-T-O-S, and of course, there is alchemy and there is astrology. These are, of course, in that world, real sciences. He originally planned, the phrase he used was a trinity of trilogies, which could only have meant 3 trilogies and a 9-volume work. He only published 1 more. I think that's one of the real sad things of his career, is that after publishing the Phoenix and the Mirror, getting it published in both hardcover and paperback in formats that got it seen, he went on and worked on a lot of other things instead of concentrating on that. I know his agent at the time, Virginia Kidd, got annoyed with him. Finally she told him to stop starting new series rather than continuing the other ones. By that time, he'd published the first volume of a trilogy. of a different trilogy called the Island Under the Earth. He had
Mhm.
published one called Peregrine Primus. These are 3 volumes, each the first of a series that were published in over a period of 3 years. There was a story called Zon, published in If magazine that same year, 1970, announced as the first of a series. So his agent really sort of got annoyed with him, and Avram responded by firing her, which
Yeah.
was probably not a good move. Avram would get testy and cut off contact with various sources of support. But it was not until 1987, 18 years later, that he finally published a second volume, Virgil in Averno, which is much shorter, much denser and darker, in its own way, just as good, but it is a very different novel. It's a claustrophobic novel, whereas The Phoenix in the Mirror shows us that world. Virgil has to undertake long and perilous travel. So we get taken on a tour of essentially the world of Virgil Magus. In Virgil in Averno, it's all set in one very rather claustrophobic place. He completed one more novel called Virgil and the Scarlet Fig. Turned over the manuscript to his agent at the time, and it was not published in his lifetime. I read it in manuscript. I thought it was kind of disorganized. It felt to me as though the first half of it was the first half of a different novel than the second half was the conclusion of, and that there were probably 2 novels in there that needed to be completed. And Avram, who was not terribly, was rather unwell at that time and tired, basically kind of said, I'm not going to be able to do anything with this. It was not published in his lifetime. It's been since published a small press. So those 3 novels and then a kind of scattering of short stories are what we have. And there's no question you would start with The Phoenix in the Mirror, and I would say go on and read the other novels. Of the short stories that were published, several of them were published posthumously. One of them is the opening chapter of The Scarlet Fig.
Yep.
Of them, they're not really major works. I don't think they were intended to be. They were little side ventures. I think he always considered this to be a major work of novels. So except for Virgil and the Dukos, which is the disconcerting oddball of the bunch, the short stories are not the best of the Virgil Magus works.
Mhm.
Virgil and the Dukos, however, is a big exception.
So, but before we get into that, I'd love to know what you're working on these days, just so you can tell folks, and then we'll get into Virgil and the Dukos.
I am finishing a science fiction novel, chunks of which I have been publishing in magazines for a number of years, and I sent off a long chunk that stands alone as a novelette to an editor just an hour ago, one that I've been working on throughout most of the fall. So testament to how teaching can slow down your writing. And I hope to finish a draft this summer at the latest, if I'm lucky, and then revise it and have another.
Do you have a title yet, so that people know what to look for?
The title is Neptune's Reach.
Okay. All right.
And pieces of it have, as I said, appeared in various magazines and anthologies.
Keep us updated.
Oh, thank you. I will.
So going into Virgil and the Dukos, do you want to give, before we listen to it, do you want to just give a really quick, just not give the story away, obviously, but maybe just give a couple of tidbits that might get, if there's something to help people kind of understand what we're about to listen to, and then we'll discuss a little more afterwards.
The striking thing about Virgil and the Dukos is that it is set in a world that is not really consistent with any of the other stories. And I don't think Avram particularly cared. It's a work that works on its own terms as a standalone story. We don't know when he wrote it. It was published in 1997, 4 years after his death. It was published in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, a magazine that Avram, in his last years, was no longer writing for because his publisher had been sold to a German-owned company, and Avram would have nothing to do with any company that had any affiliation with Germany or German companies. So we know it was sold to Asimov after Avram's death. But when he'd written it, there's no documentation that I know. All we have is this extremely dark story. And I would say, read it as a standalone story. Don't try to fit it into the arc of Virgil's life. For the most part, Avram was concerned with this. He was very clear that Virgil in Averno, the only other Virgil novel published in his lifetime, was not a sequel to The Phoenix and the Mirror. He would get very testy when he saw it, referred to it as thus, because it presents Virgil as a very young man. Whereas in Virgil, in The Phoenix and the Mirror, Virgil is, established and successful and probably in middle age. A healthy, hale, and this is important, sexually active middle age, but he's not a young man. So the novels were not appearing in chronological order, but it's clear that Avram did have an order. And I remember in the manuscript of Virgil and the Scarlet Fig, there was a little page where he just suddenly took it into his mind. He knew how the entire sequence would end and how Virgil would die. And he wrote it in a little footnote just at the bottom of the page, just for his own purposes. So he was pretty clear on the arc of this enormous project that, very unfortunately, he never completed. But Virgil and the Dukos is a sport. It takes off on its own angle and not only deserves to be regarded as a separate work, but really that's the only way it works. So you have to come into it not thinking, if a reader who had read The Phoenix and the Mirror or one or two of the other works, and feels confident that they kind of know the milieu, disabuse yourself and treat this as something entirely new.
All right, you want to get into it?
Okay, sure.
Vergil and the Dukos, Hic Inclusus Vitam Perdit, or The Imitations of the King, written by Avram Davidson, narrated by David Pickering. Sycabus the Sidonian, on business in Neapoli, called upon his old friend in fire, now the mage Vergil. And having talked of this and that, and eaten many a snail, and more than one mess of garlic and sensamum seed, querned a moil in its own oil, and dipped in with crusty Calabrian bread, they fell to talk of a few lesser things than the price of purple, and the cost of calamus and coin of gold. For does gold buy silver, or does silver buy gold? To this question not all the sages of the Midland Sea can come to a conclusion. Those who would cannot compound with those who would not. Up goes the one end of the quiver plank, and down goes the t'other. So see now, Sycabus, his yellow face assuming a serious look, and now hear Sycabus make a sound as he numbs his bread, and dipping so as to make it known he intends to talk so soon as he does swallow. Let none assume to speak until he is done. The scene is the upper room at the seaward side, the topmost floor in the house on the street of the horse jewellers. The view of the Vaux of Naples is vast. Surely the guest means to speak of it to the host. Surely the host has himself contrived it, and thus deserves a claim. Or else, like any Phoenician, this one in a moment may well speak of dye stuff, and of dye. The price set aside, some words are like to "Yond the gates of Gades, where the griffins gyre." "Where do you get all these little pots of paints, afraid of mine, eh?" Virgil spreads his dexter hand upon his bosom. He? Pots of paint, and little ones at that? Virgil wears a light shirt of vine wool, distained with mallow pink, that shade between madder and purpura. Says Sycabus, he means doors. In his own country, doors are never painted. What? Paint cedar wood? Cedar wood to paint? In all the worlds beside the great sea, the interterrene sea, no wood like unto cedar wood, of course, no. Why would paint? For beauty? For comely? Cedar is by far the lovelier than paint. As for it should last, we don't daub it with painteries, we rubs upon it with wax. With a pure wax, unfiltered from the best of bees, we rubs it, the cedars. But in the Greekly lands, if Magnor or Minora, cedar much they do not have. What have they? Oak, some, pine, such a much, and pine, though soft to cut, is quick to weather, much preservation needs. All the bees in the Grecian not sufficient wax could make. A natural thing. The Hellenes, the Achaeans also called, the folk of the oak, as make the acorns, are lovers of paint. Paint they their marble, paint they their wood, all very bright. The Dans also, they are so called. Fear the Dans. Who it was it said that? Virgil owned, having heard it, did not know who had said it. In Grecia the doors are painted so brightly your eyes they might put out with dazzle. But, from 3 Horn Sicilia, past Neapoli, northward even unto Roma town, what we see upon the doors? Here a bit of Regel paint, there a splotch of blue, somewhere else someone has a bit of green, so he smears it as thin as it were tissue of gold. Always just as small of paint, always spread it thin, so very, very thin. Sycabus quaffed a quaff of beer from the wooden quaff bound about with silvern bands, rolled his eyes above the rim to Virgil, put the drink down. "Why?" he demanded. "Why? Poverties? Shortages? Meannesses?" Virgil laughed, slightly embarrassed. He had been obliged to acknowledge that what the Sidonian had said was true. But why the South Italian mode of smearing a muchness of a variety of cheap paints on doors, and of smearing it so very thin that it could have been of no use much in preserving the wood against the wear of weather and of time, at then he was not able to say. Only now did he know. Only now. "Where is the ceremony being held this year, my Don, my Dan?" "In the Starry Chamber, my Sir Proctor. Have you not been there?" Virgil paused, showed thought. "Yes, once. My first time. I am sure I couldn't find my way there again. Someone was with me. Who? You?" Beladuc the rhetor had been coaching Virgil in the incantation, shook his head the no. "Was not me then, cannot be me now, my sorrow. Seek the 3rd right corridor from the atrium where they keep the water jars. Pursue it as far as the doors are green, go a left 3 doors, then through the red door, and—" So then Virgil understood. The doors of Sicily and all Italy, the south, had been coloured as a form of code for those who could not read. The doing once done had continued of itself, and by now most often had nothing to do with what purpose of which room behind where the door. Ah, well. As a patrician, he was in the pool of those liable for selection as proctors. More, he was a doctor in sorcery, and being in Rome, his name was drawn for proctorship at the incantation of the Dukos. It would take place in the starry chamber behind the red door. The ceremony had twice before included him, and although he had been somewhat touched, the one taking place today would touch him a deal more, a good deal more. The word was Dukos in the Greek, but almost everyone in the Latin world pronounced it Dukos. There was something said by subtle grammarians about O and U being sister sounds, but Virgil neither knew nor much he cared. What he did know was that among the Dukoi at today's ceremony one was that of Philip of Assyria, whom Virgil had known, unlike any of the other and earlier ones imitated, had known well. And the other Dukos had been imitated from his friend Quintus, the inimitable and well-beloved Quint. Inimitable? But he had been imitated. He had been. Both Philip and Quint were dead, but their Dukoi lived on. A conversation heard in the colonnades of Hercules, the sun slatting in between the pillars.
Septimus what?
Made a Dukos.
It is death to make a Dukos.
Perhaps that is why he is dead. He is dead, but the Dukos is still alive. Philip the Assyrian, a swart, saturnine fellow, keen of mind. No one knew better than Philip the art of making wine-presses, olive-presses, larger mills, water-wheels, mining drills, war-engines, and siege-machines. 'Twas these last two which, it was said in the Herculean colonnade, Apollo's court by the steps of woe, that enclave in the Aemilian wall, at all places in Yellow Rome, in fact, where folk stopped to garrulise and gossip.
What say you, my sir? Nay, but merely we exchange information. Nay, but we just...
In Philip's native hills and mountains rich in raisins, quince, pistaquim nuts, so one had said to Virgil, oft was Philip heard to laugh, head thrown back, teeth agleam. In Rome, Virgil had never even seen him smile. 'Twas his great gift and skill at making, and even alone conjecturing making, siege machines and other engines of war, which had brought Philip beyond the gates of death. Far beyond the gates of death, Dan Virgil. And Virgil had bent the corners of his lips a little. Just beyond was quite sufficient. Was it that the king of Alpha had feared Philip would prepare sapping devices for the benefit of his most bitter enemy, the king of Beta? Had it been true that Count Gamma, a sovereign and no merely titular count, had hired of Philip a set of ballistas that would have caused the walls of the Castello of Baron Delta to flake like so much pastry, but then had not paid for them, promising payment out of future booty? What? Do you doubt that your engines will work? Doubting, then, deserve no payment. Get thee gone at once. Did Delta suspect that with purses of many coins of gold, Philip might turn his hand and coat, and, after all, return to Gamma? Intrigue has no limits. In such intrigues, even a Dukos of the Assyrian would well fit in. Silently, Virgil sighed. The atrium where they keep the water jars. Where was it? This place was an enormous rabbit warren. Really, one needed a warrener as guide. And Quint? Philip, however often seen, met, conversed with, scanned scrolls together, even once or twice worked upon a work together, Philip, after all, was an acquaintance. Quintus was a friend. Quintus was a friend from earliest days and years in Rome. Quintus, with his bad eyes that never got better, and perhaps because Quint could not refrain from eating the prescribed ointments instead of applying them to the insides of his eyelids, because the salve smelled and tasted so good. Quint, who languished for the purling brooks when in the purlieus of yellow Rome, and languished for the roiling streets and quick-step scenes of the capital of the world when in the leafy quiets of the rural scenes, who much rather roses than gold, pecunia non det, and rather nuzzle the armpits of the ugliest of women than press his nose to the fairest flowers in the rose-beds of Paestum, the double-blossoming, who had first put himself out to help the very youngest of aspirant sages when new in Rome from Brunduzzi, Quint, and who had adventured his own life on the open sea to save Virgil's, though any true Roman, detesting said sea as violating the laws of nature by unstable and infirm composition, Quintus, Quinto, tied to him by 1,000 cords, and even one single thread would have sufficed. He was my closest friend, and I did love him. Why had he died? And who had wanted to counterfeit a likeness and semblance of him, and the way he moved and spoke, and somewhat smiled, the merry look that hardly could it be resisted, and the unmerry look that could never, ever be resisted at all? Who? Whose weekly letters, when they were apart, were the joys of Virgil's weeks, and whose daily discourse, when they saw one another day by day, were the joys of Virgil's days? Whose mere glance told Virgil more than half a great chamberful of books in the great museum of Alexander Town? Quint's. And now, yet Quint was dead, surely he left no lava, no evil shade behind him. Surely to his his goodly shade, one might offer grains of spelt and myrrh. Why should some shambling and unclean reflection of a creature be suffered and endured to lurch up and down the Roman roads in Quint's own likeness, reproaching his death by its own life? Not to be allowed, not. This damned building ought not to be allowed either. It was certainly not intended to have been builded as a labyrinth, but the effect was certainly that. Formerly it had been a fortress, everyone knew that, rounded so that enemies might have no corners behind which to hide or sneak, full of semi-secret passages even below ground level, so that weapons, munitions, and stores might be kept in case of civil commotion or of siege. The colossal structure even had its own flora, a muckle many plants that one saw nowhere else, and legends murmured that they had first come hither in bales of fodder and of feed for cavalry and cattle. Indeed, legend, not with this content, pushed back the origin of the enormous and baffling building even farther, said that it had been built as an amphitheatre, and that the strange plants had come thither as feeds for the wild beasts. And now, in the filthy corridors, pomegranate rinds and stones of jujube fruits, peelings of the orange, bitter-sweet.
"Are you here to do the imitations of the king?"
Someone half snarled, half barked at him. He knew that face with its unkempt beard and more than half-mad eyes. Guido Pork, the man was called, a licensed warlock and an astrologue with an only semi-licit pratique in sorcery. Nigromancy pure or impure, some did not hesitate to say.
"No, I am here to do the incantations of the Dukos."
But the man had, with a further snarl, passed on, without pausing for to listen. Thus he did. To put anyone off balance, however slightly, to cause anyone an embarrassment, however small, such things he regarded, 'twould seem, as great victories, Guido Pork. So named, said some, for his swinish habits, his manner like a boar caught pissing. Others said for his brute, the serpentine or spiny pig. Motto, touch me not save with care. Virgil strongly desired to touch him not forever, and what? What was this? All a scribble and a scrawl, taking up line after line on the scrabbled, scumbled wall, skipping many a place where the plastering had flaked and fallen off. What was this? Hic Inclusus Vitam Perdit. The one shut up here loses life. He had not seen it on either of his 2 earlier visits. Perhaps he had been careless. Perhaps it was put up since. There was indeed a representation of the labyrinth. To call it a mural would be to describe it higher than it. To call it a sketch would be to call it by less than. It was rough, irregular, vigorous, unmistakable. And, unlike the average representation, it had not one centre, but also 2. Unlike most picturations, it showed not alone the Minotaur, but his twin brother, the Tauromine, not just the man with the head of a bull, but the bull with the head of a man. Had those twain ever met outside the womb, was the instant thought in Virgil's mind, but he did not follow it. Follow it whither? Through the maze of the labyrinth? And within, there walked Theseus, sword in one hand, and in the other he held the thread supplied him as his guide by the princess, and there stood she outside the maze. Hic quem creaticus edit, Daedalus est labyrinthus, de quo nullus vadere quivit qui fuit intus, ni Theseus gratis Adrianae stamine intus. This that Cretan Daedalus brings forth is the labyrinth, from which nobody is able to walk out who once has been in, except Theseus, thanks to Ariadne with a thread inside. Translated Reno W. Odlin. The inscription was a little less crude than the art, not much. Its purpose who could know? In so many cases a graffito was merely a copy, an imitation, and perhaps even this, atypical among the graffiti though it was even so an imitation, perhaps of an original seen in perhaps Delphos, Athens, on one of many of the gates of many gated Thebes, or even in Candia, the Crete, so some scholars said, of Magno Homero, father of geography and alchemy. One never knew with a graffito. Virgil had once been told by the alchemist Clemens that he, Clemens, had spent an entire day on his side with a wax tablet and a dim and flaring lamp, copying long lists of the kings of the Etruscans, alleged to be in coded forms, as well as historical catalogues, of the ingredients for a certain philosophical experiment, only to find, with increasing feeling, astonished, outrageous, and aghast, that dynasty listed the names of Cluny, Lupo, and Blungum, all well-known local Roman professional loafers. "To think," cried Clemens, blowing out his vast mustachios, "of the waste of labour on their part, let alone on mine! And, he demanded, for what purpose did they this? For a what? For a jape? Clemens's mind could much conceive, but a jape not. And now the tufa of the corridor walls were no longer the black or grey or brown soft stone of the outer parts of the immense building, or of those with some illumination from the much encroached upon atrium, second and third-hand light as it were, but now the walls were made of orange tufa, as though by this brighter hue to make the dun less dim. And, as though some unwilling awareness that this will not do, every too many paces was a torch lisping in its socket. and by the light of one such he saw, far down the hall, a group entering a room with, indeed, prophetic Sycabus, a riddled door. Should Virgil have hastened his steps? For why? None had any other pressing task that could compare to any pressing task that he might have, and he had none. The ceremony could not commence until he were there. For whose benefit, indeed, any haste or hurry? Slowly hasten, had said the Emperor Julius II, he so fond of nibbling on stale bread, hard cheese, little fishes, had not hesitated to slay his own bay brother, no possible claimant for a throne at any future time to leave. Slowly hastened Virgil. The room was several rooms away from any direct shafts of light, and had a few several stands of many lamps, well trimmed. The room had light blue walls, the blue toned down with grey, door and framing were dull black. The ceiling was somewhat domed, concaved somewhat, and covered in darker blue, and painted thickly with stars of a king's yellow, tending slightly toward a pale green, each yellow-green star with 7 rays. The childish nature of the Guaramantes was nowhere better shown than by their simple belief that a star has but 6 rays. They have naturally made little or no progress in astrospection, and each star having the countenance of a saint. Jupiter, Saint Pluvius, with tears running down for the sorrows of mankind and woman-flesh. Saint Thor Barbarossa, giver of thunder and lightning, the both essential for omens. Odin, Saint Cyclopes, with one eye in the centre of his brow. Thrice great Hermes, Saint Mercury, the messenger of good tidings. Saintly King Poseidon, who rules the realm sea. All, and more, looked on, looked down, and it seemed that each face changed expression, cheeks moving, eyes widening or narrowing, mouths opening, closing, pursing. Rather larger than the other stars, and formed in a triangulum, Melkarth, Memnon, Minrod. All twinkled, scowled, frowned, leered. None smiled. Virgil and the magistrates exchanged salutes. It was not indeed laid down in the Pandex of Numa that any court session must begin with the judge clearing his throat. Nevertheless, almost always it did. The proceedings proceeded. Witnesses' ears were touched. Dr. Prokopiax, the chief of the physicians, forth came and testified as to what a Dukos was, he pronouncing it Dokos, that the making of a Dokos, droned old Prokopiax, or simulacrum required sperm, spittle, flesh, skin, phlegm, at the least ane strand of hair, and ane cutting of the nails of finger or an toe, all these of the person intended to simulate or imitate. That the manner in which these elements were acquired did not affect the enterprise, that although at least 1 drop of the blood must need be that of the original manus, but that after that the main quantity of gore need only be of any hot-blooded beast, of bird would not do, of bullock was most commonly of use affected, and that said gore must be of approximate the weight of the manus ipso. And that this, drone, drone, and this that, moan, moan. After which, more or less, Dr. Prokopiax chanted, or at least sang song, that the primus, the so-called significant tissue, rested 9 months in a sealed container at the warmth between that of a man's rectum. If the speaker were of a modest, not to put it prudish nature, he might say of a man's oxter, and that of a woman's privy orifice. The which, averred the Dr. Prokopiax, is well known to be the hotter and in time of emergency a source of public's fire. This heat might be supplied by some fired chamber akin to the incubatoria of the Egyptians, but it must be kept steadily hot, or, and most commonly it might be, the place of warmth used, simply in the depths of a dung-heap, whose steady and unvarying heat was commonly known to ripen cheese, and less commonly to be of avail in many alchemical procedures. At the latter point of discourse, Dr. Prokopiak's rather abruptly stopped. There was at least a whisper in the lane that a warning was issued to him, did he not, a bag might be slipped over his head.
"Having established the nature of a Dukos,"
said he, it seemed a good reluctantly,
"we now move on to the matter of the evidence."
Came forth witness who testified that the Dukoi were in the likenesses of one Philip of Assyria,
a subject of the petty king of Kurdistan, the same being a confederate and ally of the Roman emperor and empery, and of one Quinto Horatio Flaxo, a citizen of Rome.
Virgil, being proctor in this case, could not testify of any knowledge known to him, not even under an inferior title, as now and then rarely the emperor did.
"I say, of one Quinto Flaxo, a citizen of Rome, sometimes called Horry."
Thrimble, thramble, penis, puff-paste, oh, get on with it! Thundering Jove, thou droning dunce! Perhaps by reducing emotional cases to the level of a bloody bore, the Roman law meant to prevent the spread of litigation.
"Sometimes called Quint."
And here Virgil's head stopped its nodding for that day and several. Today was the day before the lustrum, the quincennial lustration, and all were in a hurry to get on with matters, the two cases therefore being tried as one. Witnesses came forth and pledged that they may be flayed and pegged if they had not seen and heard the very likeness of Philip the Assyrian discussing the manufacture of that kind of catapult called an Isadorian, and at a time when the genuine said Philip the Assyrian was registering in Muro Lucano as being a member of a pilgrimage to the shrine of Fingers Mercurius, the prince of thieves and craftsmen. Came forth witness who swore the very same and frightful oaths, and deposed that they had seen the semblance of a certain man they knew as Master Quinto leaving from an apothecary's shop with a small pottle of a well-known eye ointment, and then in a litter gone to the home of a Roman matron, the name of whom was not to be mentioned by accord of the court and for the peace of Rome, nor a loud query, did he impregnate her? Ahem. And yet that very day, videlicet the day before, and so the testimony dragged on. Many exemplar could no doubt have been give. Septimus the fabricator of the Dukoi had been questioned, and had even displayed the means and the instruments of his fabrications. He had, of course, been tortured to get this cooperation, and the fact of his next having shown the officials the details of his crime was merely another proof, no proof more being needed, of the stern and salutary effects of the torture. But then something unspeakably vile had happened. It had been intended that Septimus should, of course, be burned alive. By secret bribery he had got two of the examining officials to connive at his suicide, disguised as an accident. The truth must out, and very shortly afterward the two malefactors themselves had been first tortured and then burned. Above their screams, the judges and all the crowd of spectators had recited the last line of every judicial procedure. Rome has spoken. The matter is now concluded. At that point most of the crowd left, the games being about to start. Only a handful of boys and their pedagogues remained, the boys being obliged to get the lesson of obedience thoroughly into their small bodies, as well as being punished by not seeing the herd of monoceroids attacked by slaves mounted on ponies and armed with short lances. Several of the boys sniffled and wailed at the strict punishment for having neglected their lessons, but most bore it with a stoical attention, boding well for their futures. And, as well, stayed some minor criminals, pleased to see the judgment of those who had formerly judged them.
"There is a wheel turning in the world," Quinto Flaxo had often said, and "conceive," he'd also said at least once, "of a world crawling with Dukoi," and had shuddered. The Dukos Philip was staring with a deep intent upon the chamber's floor. Just so had Virgil often seen the veridical Philip often stare upon some pattern scratched in sand. The false Philip next raised his head, and half Virgil expected to hear him say, as so often the true one had, Messer Virgil, let us go off and discuss the matter further over cakes and wine, Messer Virgil?" Up came false Philip's head, but his eyes slid past Virgil's, as though Virgil had not been there. What a broil of intrigue and small war the life of this Dukos had for at the least 2 years been. Enough, the report went, for 2 real lifetimes. The Dukos Quint, he, out of some vat slime and stank with feculent blood, no, he could have come. It had been facing the wall with the blank face of a sleepwalker. Of some sudden second, its eyes met Virgil's, creature's eyes, as blood-shotten as the real Quint's oft had been. The idiot blankness left the face. Something moved upon the mouth. The gaze fell, the gaze half rose, fell again the gaze. Some bad movement in Virgil's belly. Something caught his cullions and bade them crawl. A shudder went quickly through the proctor's hair. "Rome has spoken," the magistrate said, less raggedly than one might have assumed, considering how unfashionable any voiced unison was among the judiciary. That such sounded false was all their explanation. Some few of them were not past giving what might pass for verisimilitude by clearing their throats, hawking phlegms, and other nasty acts. "Now concluded," the magistrate said, no drop in voice indicating that indeed this was their very last set of words. Without any formula, the stage and play passed to the proctor. Virgil was his name. He took from its place in his doe-skin budget a narrow case or quiver made of white eel skin. The case itself was sometimes used to flog the sons of patricians not yet old enough to wear the virile toga, for the white eel, said long ago the Senate, was not an animal. Therefore its skin for such an use was lawful. Not so the black. Why? Who knows why? Rome had spoken. The matter was now concluded. Virgil drew forth the slender verge of mountain ashwood. Very old it was, quite worn. "Dukos and simulacrum," he, the proctor, began reciting. To read this rite was not lawful. "I, Virgil Marius Mago, as proctor in nullification of sorcery, exsolve and absolve thee of all rule and regular imposed by your fabricator." The elder of the 2 simulacra, the Philip Dukos, stood there, slumped, of a sudden looking very weary. "And in the name of the Senate and the populace of Rome, I offer thee the choice offered to the innocent and the inculpable. Wouldst will instanter to leave all toil and pain, returning unto quiet and to dust? Or wouldst rather will become the servitor of said Senate and populace of Rome, assuming and subsuming all rule and regular thereof? Choose now, now choose now." Said the Dukos Philip, hands clasped before, head low, "I choose to will instanter for quiet and for dust." With but the tip of the ashwood verge, Virgil Proctor touched the Dukos so lightly on the crown of its head. "Fake it," said Virgil. A look of utmost gratification and of peace, something like that of a man in the instant of sexual surge and release, slipped instanter over the countenance of the Dukos Philip. In the same second its whole form sank inward and outward into its robe, with a sound of a susurration,
and a moment the garment fluttered with the inflow of an ashy matter, then lay still upon the floor. A moment's silence they gave the demise. Virgil then turned to the other. A curious small movement moved the lips of the Quinto Dukos. Had Virgil not seen such a motion before? "Dukos and simulacrum," he said. "As proctor in nullification of sorcery, I exsolve and absolve thee of all rule and regular imposed by your fabricator." Fabricator was that same Septimus who had kept his kip anigh the steps of woe, where certain malefactors sat with the heads of animals, cow, swine, dog, atop the shortened necks. They sat propped up, holding their own severed heads in their own laps, and a piece of rotten fruit clenched in teeth. "And in the names of the Senate and the populace of Rome, I offer thee the choice offered to the innocent and the inculpable. Wouldst will instanter to leave all toil and pain, returning unto quiet and to dust? Or wouldst rather become the servitor of said Senate and populace of Rome, assuming and subsuming all rule and regular thereof? Choose now, now, choose now." In that single second of silence there came again into Virgil's ears the question of the bristly lout called Guido Pork. There was a great mystic doing done by the Emperor as Roman Roy, and done but once a year, and its ins and outs and complex pacings were more than he could do, sometimes. Sometimes he practised on a simulated practice ground elsewhere, so as not to be seen by the general. A wise king, his temper controlled beneath his feet, would practise often, averroes every day. A weaker one would put it often off, and who might protest, "Your splendour has said tomorrow for many days now." Now and then rumours many tongues reported that someone of the emperor's build, with a well-made mask of the emperor's face, performed the involved and stately steps in his place. If the crops failed the next year, were the senate and the temples struck by lightning, if a fleet sank on a day of no storm in waters where no shoals, were not the immortal saints of Rome justly vexed? Eventually the ceremony underwent a change. Someone went ahead of the king, the emperor, the Roy, slowly pacing the steps. The emperor, the king, close behind, imitated. 'Twas in the nature of things that the initiatory steps did not count, though copied. Only the imitation counted. Hence a phrase, the imitations of the king. The king was not imitated, the king was imitating. In the infinite swiftness of memory, Virgil now recalled discussing it with Quint once. Quint was being poor that year. They were drinking wine. Quint had poured. Virgil was sniffing and sipping and, pausing, asked quizzically, "Falernian?" "No," said Quint. "I can't afford Falernian now. It's just common wine, weak and thin, but I had it poured into the cask of the last Falernian vintage. So something of the scent and flavour of old Falernian it has, enough to make me remember older and happier days." Virgil, still pausing now upon the question, and the echo of his answer now still sounding in the ears, said the simulacrum Quint simply, "SPQR." Senate and populace of Rome, said simulacrum Quint, a well-familiar voice. Virgil moved and touched the simulacra with the slender wooden wand, not this time upon the crown of the head, but on the right hand. The right hand for an instant blanched and blenched, its slight tan replaced by pallor. How black the much thin hair there! Then it flushed the dull colour of deep madder. That right hand of counterfeit quint turned a dark, dull red, as of madder out of Madagant or Madagaunt, that great red she-island that bleeds monthly into the circumambient world stream. On one side the Afric Ocean, and on the t'other side the vast blue Indus Sea. Island ecit called Kenotis, Red Heber, Biltis Island, Island of the Rufus Ayab, Rockland, others. Thrawn, scrannel voice from out the night, sailing down the courses of Azania, come one. The proctor gestured, and the thing with its tell-tale hand gan move out, soldiers alongside it, its stance now absolutely the slight slouch of the obedient slave. Virgil saw the eyes move toward him, but before glances could meet, turn away. A life of perhaps no great toil or pain lay ahead of it. Perhaps clerk in a warehouse of the Fisc, tutor to some public ward. Perhaps, though, there lay ahead a life of stooping beneath sacks of flour or grain in the stifling air of a state mill, or in a storehouse of the gabelle, arms and legs and mouth and eyelids red, raw, crusted, scabby, stacking slabs of salt. Condemned thus by his madder hand, he can never pass as man more, Virgil thought, not with that madder hand, never. So ran Virgil's thought, ran right after that one, this one. He could wear gloves. He might fee a physician for a concealing skin paint, perhaps find employ as a dyer. The Dukos and simulacrum reached the black-framed door. The soldiery were old and tired and indifferent, and did not push him on. Commenced to pass beneath the lintel, slightly turned his head a bit. Virgil had not stopped looking. This time, briefly, their eyes did meet. Hic Inclusus Vitam Perdit. The one shut up here loses life. Ni Theseus gratis Adrian stamine intus. Except Theseus, thanks to Ariadne, with a thread inside. What? But how escape to do these things, was Virgil's question. Pseudo Quinto, with a slight compression of his lips, turned again his head, seemed somehow to have given a slight nod, satisfied. And I would help is how, was Virgil's answer. Not quite Quint passed through the door. Rome has spoken. The matter is concluded. Is it, then? In another and more common version of the eternally familiar labyrinthal line, the thread held by Ariadne. The proctor had 3 names. None of them was Ariadne, but it was he who held the thread. This has been Virgil and the Dukos, Hic Inclusus Vitam Perdit, or The Imitations of the King, written by Avram Davidson, narrated by David Pickering.
What'd you think?
Well, probably the first thing to note is that it's a tremendously dark story. Avram always had kind of a mordant sense of humor. And throughout his career, there is a sense that things were better in the past. Even his lighter-hearted stories, such as Take Wooden Indians. Mm-hmm. The protagonist is able to escape into a past where things are more vibrant and real, rather than the present day where everything is phony and plastic. And there's trash like abstract art, afflicting the world. Later in his life, you see this more and more. The modern world represents kind of loss. One of the really major stories of his later years, a novelette called The Slovo Stove. Mm-hmm. Again, writes very affectingly about the immigrant world in the northeastern United States, about the Slovos, whoever they are, their slow assimilation into American society, how the Slovo neighborhoods were, no longer a thing, and the new generation, had no interest in the customs and superstitions of their Slovo immigrant grandparents, and something is lost, something marvelous, something that no one understands is lost and is lost forever. And this is something that we there always was in Avram's work, the sense that the present day, at best, the best that you can expect is that it will not have changed from the past. In one of his funniest stories, the story, oh dear, I'm not going to remember the title. It's one of the Esterhazy stories about my Lord Sir Smite, the English
the English wizard.
The English wizard.
Yeah, I'm not saying it either, but
at the end of the story, they're about to head out. Sir Lord has been received again into his aristocratic older brother's good graces. They're going to go back to England. His decades of exile out in Central Europe is over, and he asks, do they still serve good mutton at so-and-so's, some private club? And his brother assures him, they still serve very good mutton at whatever the place is. So you realize that things are still okay in this present day in this respect because it hasn't changed.
Right.
Change for Avram was usually for the worse. Then the Slovo stove, we see something lost. But in Virgil the Dukos, it is set in the past. Things are already bad. It is an extremely dark story. There are these things called Dukoi. You can create a Dukos, and it is something that is terribly wrong. And it's not even a note of wrongness that has been introduced into the society. The society is already a terrible society. We have this evocation of these steps where the decapitated bodies of condemned prisoners are displayed in public, sitting on the steps with their heads in their laps, wearing some humiliating sign. It's a world of appalling cruelty, and one where the division between life and non-life has been blurred. And the fact that the Dukoi even exist is testimony to this. And nothing is going to get better. The story is clearly not going to be a story where Virgil decides to make war against the Dukoi and banish their existence. It is something where really all you can do is accept that they are here, and perhaps resolve to have nothing to do with them. The other thing, of course, is you cannot fit this into the other Virgil stories. It is clear that this is not a story set at some point where someone has invented a method to create a creature called the Dukos, and Dukoi exist where they didn't in the past. This seems to be a world where Dukoi have always existed, or have existed for a long time. It is, I suppose, theoretically possible that Avram might have, had he, cared to, written a story that would sort of shoehorn in the introduction of Dukoi into this world, and then we would understand that this story takes place after every other story, because there are no Dukoi in any of the other stories. But that would be to take, I think that would be essentially misunderstood. This story lies outside the universe of Virgil and Quint and others. They're here, but it's kind of a nightmare. It's not part of the main sequence. If someone wanted to take the 4 or 5 short stories that are set, that deal with Virgil Magus, and publish them as a sequence, they would not be able to fit it anywhere. It does not belong with them. It belongs by itself. And I think it is genuinely one of his greatest stories. It has never been reprinted in any form. That 1997 edition of Asimov's is the only place where it has ever appeared. And, it was published posthumously. We don't know whether we don't know who passed the proofs. I don't know if anyone has a copy of the manuscript. We have to assume that the text is a good one. I did not, it certainly looked like late Avram prose to me. I did not see any misprints or anything. And Avram's editor at Asimov's, Gardner Dozois, had a very high opinion of his work and would not have gone in and interfered with it. So still, it'd be nice to locate the manuscript, to compare the text, to make sure that this published text is a good one, and to have it republished. Right now, very few people know about it.
Yeah, well, that'll definitely get done without a doubt. But one question that I had about the story, I guess, in listening to it, that I wasn't, well, one thing is, even though it's a standalone story, I did get the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you have a different opinion of it, it's definitely in the future. He's old. I get the sense that he's much older. And maybe I only thought that because when he was younger and his Quint shows up in an earlier story in The Scarlet Fig. And so my assumption is this is much older. Quint has already died. And so this is a copy of Quint. So it must be much later in his life. Do you think I read that wrong, or?
Not necessarily. Virgil is not a young man in that story. I have not compared the text with that of the Phoenix in the Mirror to get a sense of whether we can establish which one takes place first. My sense was, even more than Virgil being older, is that he is tired. Mm-hmm. This is a story that is about weariness with the world, weariness with the horribleness of the world. This is set in a world that is horrible. It's a dark story. It is close to a horror story. And Avram did not write horror stories very much. Of course, in the 50s and 60s, when he was writing, the horror genre per se was kind of ill-defined. There were not novels. There was not a horror section in the paperbacks section of a bookstore as there was suddenly in the 1980s. So most of what was published in that era that we will now call horror would have been considered kind of a very kind of dark fantasy or a horrific fantasy or something. So Avram did not write an awful lot of what we would call horror stories, but some of his fantasies are pretty dark, and one or two of them definitely qualifies as horror if the term has any meaning. Naples is certainly one. Mm-hmm. And Naples, like this, is a world that it's kind of a nightmare. It's an evocation of a world of terrible wrongness. Much more so even than his earlier story, Dagon, which again is kind of a horror story, although there's no actual monster. There's not glue dripping off the walls or anything. In Naples, it may well be there is, but the stories are alike in that they are set in a world in which there is a pervading wrongness that you are simply not going to, the story offers no relief from. In Virgil and Averno is a city where things have gone bad. It is a bad city. Virgil has been called there on a commission, one that as a young man he's not really able to afford to turn down, but we know he has come to the very rich city of Averno from a place outside it, his home in Naples, and there is a world outside to which you can return. In Virgil the Dukos, this is not a bad place that is within a larger world that is not entirely bad. You get the sense the universe is a bad place, in the sense of the horror is all pervading.
Mhm.
That is something that Avram did not do an awful lot. So it is a very striking story for that. Very concentrated, very powerful.
With Quint at the end, there's something happens. Like he's talking about the one. I guess my question with Quint, who's his friend, do Dukoi have the memories of their past lives, or do they not? I mean, it's a little confusing. Or they have part of them, or do you have a sense of that?
We never get a sense of any interiority to a Dukos. We don't know what its inner life is like. It is not a blank slate, but we are certainly not expected to understand that they have a soul to them. So to compare this story to a much earlier and much lighter one of Avram's, the Golem, there is a kind of existence to them that is kind of a half-life. And that might be a little scarier than being like, say, a vampire, where the vampire was once human. There is something to the vampire that is trapped in the vampiric state, that you can, their soul could be released, perhaps to salvation, if their earthly form is killed. So in the classic vampire stories, which are pretty dark, it's clear that there is a soul that has been perverted or has been compelled or something like this. But a golem, for all that, especially in Avram's version, they have a kind of wit. They have some kind of cognition. You would not say they have souls. You would not say they have an inner life. And the Dukos, in the same way, while we don't get to look into the soul of a Dukos, and I think we are to understand that that is a prospect we would recoil from in horror if it were available to us. There is nothing in there anymore that is wholly, that is really human. They are no longer human, less than human, and it's more disturbing than if they're dead, because they are not. I know that I don't know that Avram was much of a fan of Sigmund Freud, but he was, of course, living in the era of the heyday of Freudianism. He would have been aware of Freud's very famous definition of the uncanny, which is when the borderline between living and unliving becomes unclear. And certainly the horror that pervades that story shares that. A Dukos is not simply, not simply a swamp monster, not simply a golem or a goslin. Goslins have inner lives. Goslins are nasty little fuckers. We know that goslins enjoy messing up with people. They are not nice, but they have agency. They are imps. They were created by the God that created all of us. Although perhaps they have turned bad, we don't know their backstory. Some things we're not supposed to know. Whereas a Dukos is something that should never have come into existence. It was not present at the creation, and is a sign of a flaw in the in the nature, in the substance of the universe. They're a bit of wrongness that threatens to spoil everything else.
Question for you, I guess, kind of last question on this. The Dukoi, did Avram make them? I mean, I know the people, obviously there's spectrums of undead, but did they exist at all in mythology, or was that completely a made up type of mythological presence within that time? Am I making sense? Like, if you looked throughout Roman literature, would there be any sort of mention of Dukoi?
I always assumed that Avram made this up.
Okay.
Now, when the book, when the story came out in 1997, the World Wide Web was 1 year old, and you could not go on and just search among things. Today, you probably could and do a deep search on the word Dukos and get a good sense of, if Avram had come upon a reference to it in some arcane literature. Those books are increasingly available online, or later books refer to them and you'll catch it that way. But my sense at the time, and I have not come upon anything since to challenge that, is that this is something that Avram made up. He was like the boss on the wall. He made it up.
Yeah.
I don't think. I'm pretty sure he made up the word Gosselin. They're kind of, the word sounds like a little bit like goblin. They're imps. They're not wholly unfamiliar. They're not something that no one has ever thought of anything remotely like them before, but they are a creation of his. And I think the Dukos, word and all, is something that Avram invented himself.
The word, I don't know why this word just kept jumping out at me every time I read it and listened to it, was the word decoy. Copy, a decoy.
Yes.
Decoy. Just that connection kept popping in. Do you think there's anything there?
I think so. I think you see the word Dukos and a few kind of things niggle at you. Of course, there was also Duke. Well, there's nothing royal or exalted about these things. We get the Greek suffix, which hints that they are not new. The world of Virgil Megas was the world of the Roman Empire, post-Greek. So there's this, from the name, you would get the idea that even in this world, they've been around for a while. But yes, decoy is certainly there. There is a falsity to them. They are simulations. And of course, the idea of the simulacrum has been a very big one in postmodern thoughts for the last 25 years, at least, in English. And I suspect you could speculate on the Dukos as a simulacrum, as a radically imperfect copy, full of falsity and wrongness of a human being, which is, of course, in Jewish thought, as well as in much Western thought, the worst thing you can make a copy of. That is what you're not supposed to do. And the world of the story is full of it. And even Virgil Magus kind of recoils from it. It's not something he can do anything but warn friends away from.
Wow. So I guess moving on to a little different subject, one of the things I always talk about in these episodes, and the reason I talk about it is, how would you treat a particular story in a film or a series? And the reason I do that is, as I've spoken to many authors, a lot of the authors of our generation have just disappeared. They've faded. And, the one, not the only exception, but one big exception to that is, well, Philip K. Dick, Asimov. And the reason that's happened is because they've made films. and they've made story and series, and those catch on. And when those catch on, they seem to revitalize the author. In this case, and I certainly think there are a number of Avram stories that would make incredible stories and films. When I first read Phoenix in the Mirror, it was challenging for me to even, as I said, to even understand what was going on. As I've read it over and over again, I now sort of see how it kind of have a better sense of how it could work. Certainly could see the vision if someone had a vision of a pretty incredible world. But with that said, I like to play with the idea of who would play Virgil. If you were to pick a particular actor, which actor do you think could play Virgil?
Okay. I think a Hollywood producer would first think of a powerful mage-like figure, and the first name to come to mind would be Ian McKellen. Someone like Gandalf, something like Dumbledore, and I would say no to that. Virgil was not a powerful elderly figure with a staff, able to wield mighty forces. In the Phoenix in the Mirror, Virgil seems to be in early middle age, and he is a scholar. This is important. Virgil he's got a laboratory, a working laboratory. He is not the kind of scholar. He's not like Indiana Jones, who supposedly is an academic, but he's always going out on digs. And when he's on a dig, you don't see him at the bottom of a pit with a toothbrush, carefully brushing away pieces of minute slivers of stone and then labeling them. No, he's throwing his fists around. He's punching Nazis and grabbing idols and running away with them. He's a figure of action, and Virgil is not. Virgil is a scholar. And he's not a big man. There is, I believe, no description of Virgil, but I would say if you wanted to cast him, I would be thinking someone more like Alec Guinness, kind of a small man, a thoughtful one. Virgil was a product of the Roman Empire. So he would not look like James Bond. Mm-hmm. He was not Jewish, and I think he was not a big, imposing, heroic figure. He was someone who sat down and cast horoscopes. He was someone who would carry out minute calculations and then set into progress some complicated alchemical procedure that had to be done very precisely. If he needed material that he could not obtain, he would travel. But he was, 40% engineer and 60% scholar. So he would become less like James Bond and more like George Smiley in a sense.
I think about a lot of Avram's characters. There are so few that are true, men of action, as you put it. I mean, they are, and I don't know if you noticed, I put a post about if you it'd be kind of fun to do, in the Avram Davidson universe, create a timeline.
Yes.
And I see a direct connection, for example, you'd almost say maybe they were related between Esterhazy and Virgil. I mean, in terms of kind of what they do, it's more like closer to a Sherlock Holmes than a James Bond. I kept thinking, they did mention that Virgil had he was large chest and skinny legs. So he was a little kind of muscular, but skinny. I don't know. I was thinking a young Patrick Stewart as an example of someone who could probably pull it off in a less action mode. But obviously, for Hollywood, you'd have to probably put a little bit more action in it to make it work, because I don't think you could just, so you'd have to add some action to it. As the Minotaurs are chasing him, he might be taking down a few Minotaurs, and there may be you would just have to, in order to give it that excitement. A few punches would need to be thrown, and he did throw a punch here and there.
A bit, I guess. If there was ever going to be a dramatization of The Phoenix and the Mirror, it would probably work better as a 6-part BBC series than as a Hollywood movie, where there would need exploding automobiles and such. What you say about Dr. Esterhazy, of course, is very apposite. Esterhazy clearly was a Virgil figure. And I remember the Esterhazy stories. The first volume, Avram had he said, written pretty much in one surge, about 6 or 7 weeks. So they all came out in 1974, 75. And by that time, I was in college, and every time Avram began a new series, and he was still beginning new series, I would think, okay, but when are you going to write another Virgil novel? When are you going to write the sequel to the Phoenix and the Mirror? He'd written a little short story called Peregrine Alflandia, which was obviously going to be the first chapter of Peregrine Secundus, but it was many years before he wrote the rest. And it was clear that Esterhazy was shared the sensibility of Virgil, and of course, they both share the sensibility of Avram. There is one or two characters that were like this. Jack Limekiller is a younger version, someone who certainly looks as though he could double up his fist and toss him around a bit when he had to, although he doesn't. But the series that was What Stories There Were all published as one story, and it appeared only once, was Redward Edward, in that very strange novella called the Redward Edward Papers, who again appears to be this kind of scholar figure who is investigating strange old corners of the world, both in the past and into unexplored corners of the globe. And the story, this novella, which appeared in a tiny little Doubleday collection that got no attention whatever, has never been reprinted in any form, is kind of baffling in that all the little stories are kind of nice, but you're not sure where they're going to build. And in the end, it ends in a story that is sheer autobiography of Avram and his younger son, his first son, taking a train ride together. And that's the story. It's a very unusual, peculiar one. But all of these are kind of Virgil figures. Late in life, he seemed to have been spending more energy on Engelbert Esterhazy. He wrote a second series of stories, all of which were published in Amazing Stories, I believe. He wrote one story that he announced as the beginning of a third. He apparently spoke of or thought about an Esterhazy novel. I know that your mother had an outline for something.
The goat, something.
A goat for Azazel.
Yes.
And she showed it to me once, and it was an outline. And I asked her how much actual pages of the novel written by Avram there were. And she was a little cagey about answering, which I took to mean there weren't many, and that she would write it if someone bought it, and nobody did. At this point, in the mid-1990s, Avram's commercial fortunes were at very low ebb. I think everyone realized this would not be a novel by Avram Davidson. It would be a novel by Grania Davis, written around something of Avram's, and that did not seem to be a sufficiently commercial venture. So I don't know what Avram intended, whether there was a serious outline, but it's clear that Esterhazy continued to work on his imagination. And as much as I like those stories, I really wish he was able to return to Virgil. And I think the major Virgil works were novels. Whereas the Esterhazys, he never wrote an Esterhazy novel. They were all these novelettes, and they were very colorful and very lighthearted. And Virgil was not lighthearted. And it just may have been that late in his life, when he was not always having good health, when he often, felt kind of dark about things, Esterhazy felt just a more congenial project.
Yeah. Well, this has been amazing. I cannot thank you enough. I've taken so much of your time. Any last things that you'd want to say, or just anything you'd want people to know about Avram in general before we sign off?
He was primarily a writer of short fiction. And if you have to liken him to someone, John Collier is a name that comes to mind. I think he is at least as good a writer as John Collier. Withal, he wrote 2 or 3 very important novels. I don't think anything was better than The Phoenix and the Mirror. The second Virgil novel, Vergil and Inverno, is darker, shorter, but it's worthy of standing alongside The Phoenix and the Mirror. But while everything he wrote was interesting and worth reading, including the science fiction novels he wrote in the 60s, none of which are, as I said, quite as good as his best work at the time. Nonetheless, there are 5 or 6 volumes that especially stand out. The 2 Virgil novels, of the other novels, probably Island Under the Sea, the Esterhazy stories, and then enough of his best short fiction to make for a nicely sized fat volume. The Avram Davidson Treasury was such a volume. It got most of his major work. It does not have Virgil and the Dukos. It has maybe 1 or 2 stories in it that could be substituted for the best of the stories that are not in it, but it's a surprisingly good volume. Mm-hmm. And all of these should be returned to print. It's nice that they are available as electronic books. What I'd really like to see is trade paperbacks that could appear in bookstores, and that would be the best way to keep his name in front of readers.
Well, thank you. I can't thank you enough, and again, thank you for keeping his legacy alive.
No, you're very welcome. It's been nice working with you. And nice talking today.
Thanks so much.
All right.
God only knows. It sounds like a story to me. Some crazy fable.